So I've been told that one of my jobs is to be the person that introduces the speakers. Years ago, my first job as a teenager was as a radio announcer, and even though I grew up in a little small town in Georgia, I had to learn to speak without my accent to read the news. So I guess that prepared me for this moment. So our first speaker will be Bruce Fuller, a professor of education and public policy at the University of California, Berkeley.
Thanks to Mario and Scott for the invite to be here. I'm particularly excited because it gave me an excuse to find a whole new background for my PowerPoint slides. Mario, at the end of the session yesterday, had a nice diagram trying to look at this articulation between the macro system and what he was calling face-to-face interaction on the ground. And a lot of my work has sort of moved from this macro system, from kind of a neo-institutional perspective, given my training in sociology of organizations, to face-to-face interaction. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of that transformation in my work. I think about it really in terms of 3 levels of analysis. Mario's diagram had 2. I've been more lately interested in the articulation between the center of organizations and their peripheral units out in poor neighborhoods. I did a book a number of years ago on charter schools as an example of this. In the charter school world, we've had a consolidation of capital, so to speak, around organizations like KIPP, Green Dot charter schools in LA. We have fewer mom and pop charter schools out in the world than we used to, and we have sort of consolidated capital and so-called charter management organizations, just like we have HMOs in healthcare. We've got CMOs in education now. And I did a book on preschools, kind of looking at the role of NGOs and preschools. And I started at the macro system because I saw these as kind of sites of neoliberal struggle, so to speak, sites of ideological contention around how we raise kids. And the more I got into this, the more I realized that the evidence was not all that convincing that these decentralized, localized organizations were actually helping poor kids and helping poor families. So I think it's sort of 3 levels of analysis, sort of this macro system that we talked about yesterday, then organizational fields. This isn't on the slide, by the way. This is testing your ability to multitask at 8:30 in the morning. Fields of organizations, we talked a little bit about this with the panels yesterday. And then within organizations or within networks of organizations, we have a center and we've got these peripheral units. We see this in Head Start, where HHS is constantly trying to regulate Head Start, and the peripheral units out in NGOs and communities are resisting the centralization. We see it in charter schools. We see it in other sectors. So I want to talk a little bit about the drift towards mixed markets in education, and what we're finding out about the effectiveness of these mixed markets. And the punchline to this first part of the story is mixed markets are not particularly working any better than mass institutions in terms of lifting poor kids, with some encouraging news in certain subsectors. And then I want to go to the face-to-face level that Mario talked about yesterday, because I think the effectiveness of these localized institutions is constrained by the fact that they're not changing social relations face-to-face. There's a lot of contention around charters, there's a lot of contention around localized clinics in the healthcare sector, which I've been getting into more recently. But they're not really changing the nature of interaction between teacher and student, between doctor and patient on the ground. So to some extent, I'm a little less convinced now that there's correspondence between the macro system and the social relations on the ground. I'm not being trained by John Mayer, neo-institutionalists. We were always trained to think that there was this sort of correspondence and this sort of hegemony in the culture between levels of analysis, and I'm not sure there is, or not as convinced as I used to be. Okay, let me start off with this. Why should we look at these localized organizations? Why look at mixed markets? And in the paper, I've got some kind kind of depressing numbers about why the central state is likely to decline over the coming half century. At the federal level, and this is going to sound a little bit like George Bush for the first 3 minutes, but bear with me. At the federal level, the central state is vastly overextended. The CBO just recently put out a report indicating that if under current conditions, we'll be paying about $780 billion a year in interest payments on the national debt. That's about what we spend in discretionary outlays outside of entitlements. Entitlements will take up about 16% of the federal budget, including, 16% of GNP, including health care. If you look at sort of long-term trends in trust in government, a lot of you have seen this before, this legitimacy and this basic endorsement of the role of central governments declining in the US and many of the OECD countries. There's a rising disenchantment with central regulation. We've got major failures in centralized regulation like No Child Left Behind, huge micromanagement from DC, very, very few effects on test scores over time. Demographic shifts, these numbers are really quite startling. In 1950, there were 7 workers in the US for every retiree. In 2030, there'll be only 2 workers for every 1 retiree. So how do we sustain kind of these entitlements, sustain the socialization, the collectivization of risk that we talked about at the end of the day yesterday? How can we sustain that under the current version of a central state? So there's this drift towards decentralized policy tools, a drift towards reliance on mixed markets in the education sector. Some of these cases you're probably familiar with. We've had big experiments with school vouchers. Florida is still in the midst of a major experiment where dollars for schools are voucherized if the school is not performing well over 2 to 3 years. We've had tuition tax credits that state governments are passing. Pell Grants essentially are portable vouchers for college students. In the healthcare system, we're seeing reliance on incentives. In welfare reform, we've got EITC growth, and we've also got income disregard policies where folks can keep larger segments of their income. So there's this ongoing drift towards reliance on NGOs. You can't see the bottom of this, but in terms of the growth of NGOs, in 1970, there were 187,000 NGOs in the US, and last year there were 859,000 NGOs that filed for 501c3 status. So we've got this drift over the last generation towards mixed markets, towards incentives, kind of the rekindling and faith in behavioral economics as a policy strategy, and a move away from a centralized regulatory state. Now the second problem is that as this move towards mixed markets has expanded, there's been a really blossoming of empirical research on the effectiveness of small-scale NGOs. And in the paper, I talk about really 4 cases briefly, and there are other folks have done more detailed literature reviews of this. In general, some of these experiments have been colossal failures. The effects from school vouchers have been very disappointing. Paul Peterson at Harvard and his group have done a number of random trials, random assignment trials, and found very uneven effects. The Gates Foundation put about $1 billion into small high schools, including schools here in Chicago, and those effects were highly uneven. There were some slight gains in high school graduation rates, but overall largely disappointing. There are more promising results with in a couple other subsectors, including preschools and charter schools. My paper kind of does detail that. Chicago, as many of you know, has been a center of some of this work on early education through the parent-child centers and CPS. Those centers have been shrinking, ironically, with the shifts in housing as the projects come down. There are fewer and fewer parents to populate these parent-child centers that have actually proven to be quite effective for low-income, mainly African-American kids. The charter school experiment, I'm sort of remain cautiously optimistic, although on balance, charter schools nationwide are not producing stronger results for low-income kids compared to regular public schools. The Stanford study last year showed that charter high schools actually have a depressing effect on achievement on average. On the other hand, we do have examples like KIPP and other so-called CMOs, charter management organizations, that are showing strong results, but we can't go to scale very effectively yet in the charter movement. So the second problem here is, as the central state shrinks, it moves towards mixed markets, it moves towards market-oriented incentives, but at least in the education sector, the results have been quite uneven over the last 15 or 20 years, derived both from random clinical trials, from quasi-experimental designs. People have been employing various methods, as Steve Raudenbush was talking to us yesterday about. And independent of the methods, we're not finding dramatic effects. So the question then is, well, how do we raise the efficacy of these organizations? And there are some theory-building challenges very much related to yesterday afternoon's conversation. Part of the problem here is, how do we study dynamics across different levels of analysis? The policy talk and the ideological contention around initiatives like charter schools and preschools doesn't really get us down to the social relations face-to-face inside these organizations. It doesn't get us to the question of what is the variability in face-to-face interactions across charter schools or in preschools or in small high schools. So we're just now beginning to kind of articulate theories that cross these levels of analysis. The policy theories have largely been unattentive to mediators and these sort of micro interactions that occur. So we're just now sort of getting into the guts of these organizations to see whether it's altering social relations inside or not. And then there's sort of the long-term, I think, theoretical risk of ignoring the center. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the field work we're doing in Pennsylvania in a very progressive healthcare organization, where a lot of the decentralization is being driven by a very smart and sort of surgically incisive center around data, around best practices, around incentivizing preventive care. So part of the theory building challenge here is not to take our eye off the center as we're studying what's going on inside the guts of localized NGOs and local units linked to the center. And then, of course, there are different explanations of ineffectiveness in these mixed markets. Resources is an obvious one. Staffing is a big problem, especially in a lot of charter schools. Massive turnover of teachers in charter schools, especially the KIPP chain and other CMOs, so to speak. Diminished accountability from the center, so as the center shrinks, it has less legitimacy to hold local units accountable. And so what happens when NGOs are not effective? Who's actually going to hold them accountable? We see that in the charter school world, in the Head Start world. It's a huge problem. So this diminished accountability is an issue. Now the last one here is the one that I've been doing much of my work in, and I'm going to perseverate on this for just a couple minutes of my remaining 3 minutes. And that is, how do these local organizations actually change the cultural scripts of clients, the behavioral patterns, the day-to-day activities in which adolescents are engaged, or Latino families with young children are engaged. And I won't go through all of this in the interest of time, but the paper does try to walk through these different theoretical perspectives that have been maturing in sociology, to some extent in cultural psychology, different ways of trying to understand the tacit cultural patterns that clients, so to speak, follow in their own communities. And the extent to which NGOs, like charter schools, preschools, housing cooperatives, the extent to which these local organizations actually touch and scaffold from local behavioral scripts. This links to Mario's work. David Harding is here. His new book is, I think, really very illuminating in understanding the cultural scripts and tacit practices of adolescence in Black and Latino communities. My own group at Berkeley has been doing work with Latino families where we try to understand what is their parenting strategy, how are they trying to raise their youngsters, and then do preschools and charter schools and other NGOs actually have much of an understanding of the parenting goals and the cultural preferences of Latino families. Okay. The one point I'd make here is that this notion of responding to the local cultural scripts of clients and families that are being served it's not a radical idea. It's sort of a new notion in the academy, and we're devising better theories about how to connect and scaffold up from these behavioral scripts. But essentially, this is what organizations do in middle-class communities, right? If art's being cut in the local elementary school in an upper middle-class community, the school is highly responsive. It's trying to scaffold up from the preferences of these families and kids. But we don't think too much about this when we try to parachute in and deliver services in poor communities. And there have been big, expensive results of ignoring these preferences. The MTO experiment, one of the interesting findings was a lot of the Black adolescents were going from the middle-class communities back to their own communities. And until anthropologists got in there and figured this out, no one understood why some of the effects on Black adolescent males were tepid at best. So there are big costs in sort of ignoring these natural scripts and these cultural practices. I need to wind down. The paper has some of the work we do with Latino families in California and Arizona, trying to understand their cultural scripts, their tacit practices, how NGOs try to build from their work. And some of the work we're now doing is in the healthcare sector, where we're studying the extent to which decentralized healthcare organizations are working with patients, hiring case managers, and trying to build from the practices, the motivational structures, and the preferences of patients in medical care settings. So this conversation is really moving across sectors as well. I'll stop there and happy to send the paper to folks that want to see some of the details. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Joe Galaskiewicz from University of Arizona.
All right, thank you. I have two co-authors here that I want to acknowledge. Both of them were graduate students at the university, PhD students at the University of Arizona. They've now gone on, gotten their PhD, and on to bigger and better things. Also should acknowledge the people who funded this research project. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues, Bragger, McPherson, and Lauman, who actually provided inspiration for the type of analysis they're going to see today. And I should probably add Scott and Mario, too, for organizing this conference. So thank you very much. What we're going to talk about today is what children do in their free time. And we're going to be focusing on one community, Phoenix Mesa metropolitan area. Now, there's a great deal of research that's been done on what children do in their free time. And as you can see, a lot of it has to do with sitting in front of television set and clicking away, as our friend here on the right is doing. The research, though, that really captured the imagination of a lot of people in this area was the research done by Annette LaRue. And what she argued was that when you look at what children do in their free time, there's real variation by class. Not so much by race or ethnicity, but by class. And she talked about how, in her research, middle-class families, for the most part, engaged in organized events for their children, and poor families allowed their children to pursue more unstructured activities or play. during their free time. Now, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about activities, but we're also going to talk about providers. I'm very interested in the organizational level, the so-called meso level, which was referred to yesterday, and how these organizations essentially divvy up the community in terms of who they provide services to. Now, I'm going to be looking at three types of providers, three general types of providers: for-profits, nonprofits, and government agencies. And I'm going to consider the fact that they all have different logics, organizational logics. Now, the question is whether or not it makes any difference in terms of who ends up as being their clients. So that, for example, in the for-profit sector, there's this notion that they are profit-driven, they're more efficient, they're technologically advanced, and they're customer-oriented. Actually, there seems to be enough empirical proof in comparative studies that that's accurate. Nonprofits, on the other hand, tend to be mission-driven. They tend to be more participatory. They tend to be resource-poor. Again, research pretty much confirms that. And government, in contrast, tends to be more service-driven. They're more monopolistic, more rules-based, and tend to be more politically aware. Now, in the paper, which our discussant got, I actually formulated hypotheses about who will serve whom. But upon reading those, I wasn't totally convinced that it's yet time to draw a hypothesis. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to proceed inductively. Now, the question is one of equity. And this is really where the rubber meets the road. For-profits. Are for-profits, should they be concerned with issues of equity? I think you'll find very, very few for-profits that would say that that's really their issue at all. That essentially their responsibility is to their stakeholders, or to their shareholders in particular, their stakeholders more generally, but certainly not to ensure that everybody gets equal access. Governments, yes, but it depends on the political will. So that governments will be interested in providing services to all, but it all depends upon, again, the political will. Nonprofits are more complicated because it really depends upon the mission. So that, for example, some nonprofit organizations, they serve primarily members' interests. And so the idea of broad equity is really not a very important issue on their agenda. Others are very interested in political and social reforms. They're what are called social welfare organizations. They don't really provide services to people. And so this equity thing is not really their concern, except that they sometimes work for greater equity in the system as a whole. Others provide services and goods directly to the community. These are called charitable nonprofits. These are the ones that we're often familiar with as being our sort of neighborhood community-based nonprofit organizations. But even public charities, the situation with regards to equity is complicated. First of all, if you go to the IRS, a charity is defined as something that includes relief for the poor, the distressed, and underprivileged. That's the terminology the IRS actually uses. But many activities qualify you as a public charity that have nothing to do with service to the poor. And that, in fact, being charitable, there is no really legal obligation for any nonprofit to be charitable in the strict sense of the term. They're supposed to further the public, not the private ends, but serving the public interest can take on many different forms, not only just simply redistribution. Now, there's a literature review. We're running a little bit late, so I'll skip through that. And let's move directly to the case. Our research is in Phoenix Mesa metropolitan area. It's out in the middle of the desert. It really is out in the middle of the desert. For those of you who don't know, Phoenix Mesa Metro is the 12th largest MSA in the United States. It has about 32% Hispanic, 5% Black, 2.5% Native American. Is the 9th largest percentage of households with children under 18, so it sort of breaks the stereotype that a bunch of old retired people are out there in the desert. It's not true at all. And in Phoenix and Mesa proper, only 19 and 12% of individuals are below poverty. Now, there's been some recent press about how the state is the second poorest in the country, but that's taking into account the entire state. When you look at the metropolitan areas, they're not that impoverished. And this is probably just to give you an image of what Phoenix looks like. This is probably one of the best images that I can come up with. Now, the study that we did was of 5 and 12-year-olds. We did this back in 2003, 2004. We partnered with ASU. They surveyed 1,036 families. We obtained diary data on what one child in the household, what they did the past Saturday. That's the way diary data is usually collected. We got information on what they did, where they did it, when, and who provided the service. You can't digest this in 30 seconds, but basically we began with 1,036 households. We found that 840 had activities outside the home. 196 did not have activities outside the home for their child. We interviewed the parents, I should say. Of those that had activities outside the home, 743 of those households had activities that benefited the child, and there are 1,256 activities that these 743 children participated in. And this gives you an idea of breakdown. And then on the bottom are the breakdown for the organizations that provided these services. As you can see, we're broadening it out. This is far beyond children's services or education. This includes everything from shopping to going to a kiddie park to having lunch at Chuck E. Cheese. It includes everything. We geocoded these and plotted them across the map. We may come back to this. I'm just trying to give you an idea of where things are. They are distributed across the landscape. I also found some interesting finding in analyzing who actually participates in activities outside the home. The dependent variable in this logistic regression is simply whether or not the child participated in an activity that benefited him or her. And what we find is that there's a direct relationship to income. So that the children, one way of reading this is that children from poorer families were less likely to engage in any activities that benefited them. We also found that children whose caregiver had lower levels of education were less likely to participate in activities outside the home. We also found that Hispanic children were less likely to participate in activities outside the home, although the effect is only significant at the 0.10 level. If the caregiver works on Saturday, they are less likely to participate in activities outside the home. And then finally, if the caregiver was single, they were more likely to participate in activities outside the home. Again, something that maybe goes against common knowledge. When we look at what the different families use, what the children use, we can compare families that have $20,000 or less in annual income, 20 to 60, 60 to 110, and over 110. And if you look at government tribe, what you can see is that on the top row for the families, we get about 30% of the children use government or tribe facilities. When we move down to the families that are over 60,000, it drops to 13 and 12%. If we look at households, about 27% of the families under 60,000 will use households. When we drop down to the wealthier families, it goes to 18 and 22. When we look at nonprofits, we see that among the families that are below 60,000, about 6% use nonprofits. And when we go to look at families at over 60,000, it's about 15%. Okay? We can see how this plays out in terms of a correspondence analysis. Essentially, what we see is that we have upper income families using nonprofit organizations. We have, on the other hand, we have lower income families using government and tribes. Now, a lot of this has to do with the fact that different types of providers provide different types of activities. And so we have to look also at the activities that children are engaged in. Now, because of the shortage of time, we'll skip through that. But I will show you one summary chart, which is essentially that is the income of the family goes up, the likelihood of them participating in sports goes up. As the income of the family goes up, participating in entertainment goes up. As the income goes up, socializing goes down. And as the income goes up, play goes down. So that essentially what you have are wealthier families engaging in sports activities using nonprofits, and you have poorer families engaging in play activities using public facilities. Actually, it's parks. Now, we did a multinomial logistic regression, and essentially we confirmed those results. We found that when we compared high-income to low-income families, we found that the low-income families were more likely to use a government or tribe as opposed to a nonprofit or a church. And we found that low-income families were more likely to use house, street, or desert instead of a nonprofit or a church. Why don't nonprofits serve the poor? And I'll conclude with this question. One is simply a demand-side explanation. It could be that poor people dislike nonprofits. Well, that's actually not the case. We have data. I won't show it again for the sake of time. But it also could be that nonprofits are not located in poor areas. And actually, it turns out to be that may be the case, but with qualifications. When we ask low-income people, why don't you use nonprofits, a lot of times we just heard there aren't a lot near us. There aren't that many near us in our communities. I never used them. I say they're news. We've never been involved with the organization. I say possibly we haven't had that much dealings with them. So what we did, in conclusion, I have to show you this map for Scott. This is Scott's forte, is that we geocoded all of the nonprofit organizations that provide services to children on the map of Phoenix. We also overlaid the churches, which are the ones in red. The nonprofits are in yellow. The areas that are highlighted are the 10 poverty areas. And what we can see is in some respects there is vacant space, if you will, in some communities. And while in other communities there's just as many nonprofits as you can possibly imagine. We did an analysis where we then correlated the number of nonprofit organizations and the number and the income, the median family income within a zip code, and we found no effects. We found no effects. But then, as we looked a little bit more deeply, we then separated out the sports-providing nonprofit organizations, and we correlated that with median family income, and we found a strong and significant positive effect. So that essentially what our respondents were reporting is indeed true, that the sports-related nonprofit organizations are not in their communities. In fact, when we looked at the 149 nonprofit organizations mentioned by respondents, 70% were sports-related. When we interviewed them, we saw that almost all were run by middle-class parents who have the time and money to support them. And as I just said, it's not that we suspect, we know that most of them are not located in poor neighborhoods. Thank you.
Bessie Wilkerson from Harlem Children's Zone in New York City.
Good morning, everyone. I am the Director of Educational Research at the Harlem Children's Zone. Despite that fancy title, I am not presenting research findings today because the kind of research we do is mostly not the kind of research that you guys mostly like to sit and look at. What I'm going to talk about is some of the principles behind what we do at the Harlem Children's Zone, which will hopefully along the way describe a little bit what the Harlem Children's Zone does. We are one of these organizations that people have been talking about for the last 2 days. We reach a large number of children in central Harlem, in Manhattan, and provide a whole host of services to them. A little bit of history and current context. I know some people know about us. I know some people have probably never heard of us. The Harlem Children's Zone started in 1970 as the Reedland Center for Children and Families. It was primarily a truancy prevention program at the time. In the 90s, there was really this realization that it was really hard to do truancy prevention work in isolation when there are so many other problems that the kids were facing, and this idea to do a concentrated geographic area and try to provide all the services that the kids would need to help them succeed in life was born. And in 1997, the first phase of the Harlem Children's Zone began. And the third and final phase began in 2007. And right now we cover about 100 square blocks in central Harlem. I'll show a map later. And the idea is to provide really anything that we can for those kids. And the ultimate goal that we have for our kids and for all the kids in the zone is for them to get into college and to graduate from college. And we provide services all along the age continuum, wherever they are, to try to get them to that goal. We've gotten a lot of public attention recently because President Obama became interested in the model, and he announced that he had a plan to replicate the Harlem Children's Zone around the country and use that as an anti-poverty initiative. So he announced Promise Neighborhoods. In 2010, the first 21 grantees were funded. They were given about $500,000 each for planning grants, and the plan was to have much larger grants in the coming year for implementation. As I'm sure is shocking to everyone here, with the federal budget the way it is, we have no idea how much money will be around for those communities. But right now there are 21 communities in their planning year. There are a lot more communities that are interested in this work and doing something like this, or interested in doing something like this around the country that didn't get the federal money. I believe there were 300 communities that applied for Promise Neighborhoods grants in that first round. This map is over a year old, so it's out of date, but these are just a few number of the communities that have visited. We have a practitioners institute at HCZ where people can come visit and learn about our model. And these are just some of the communities that have visited us, just to give a sense of what that interest has been like. And so in the process of the more and more public interest we've had to really be thoughtful about what it is that we think is central to our model if you wanted to replicate our model. Very often when groups visit, they want our preschool curriculum or something very specific. And we feel strongly that it's not any one specific program that we do that is part of our work, that is the central part of our work, but that it is these principles I'm going to talk about now that would look different in every community because it's designed specifically to meet the needs. What we do is designed specifically to meet the needs of the community where we are. So the first principle that we think is critical is that these types of interventions be neighborhood-based and be at scale. So not trying to reach a few kids in the neighborhood, but trying to reach the vast majority of the kids in the neighborhood. And so the phase one, the bottom part of the zone, you can see started first, and then we added the second part, and we're still moving into phase three. It's a funny shape because it's the shape of a zone for a public school, and it became easier to try to reach kids that were all in the schools. I think there's 5 public elementary schools in the zone. We work in all of the schools, and we have one of these numbers that's always changing, something like 22 sites around the zone where we provide different kinds of programs. And really central to the model that we do is being at scale and not just trying to reach a small number of kids, because it's really trying to change, to a certain extent, those cultural scripts of the whole neighborhood. The second principle of what we do is a pipeline of support reaching kids at every age and based on best practices. So I spend a lot of my time at work translating what a lot of the people in this room and people like you do, looking in program evaluation to try to identify best practices so that we can incorporate them into our various programs. I much less frequently interpret our program work for researchers. But the idea of the pipeline is that at every stage along the way, we have programs to address kids, developmentally appropriate programs to address kids of that age, to get them where at that age they need to be if they're going to go to college and graduate from college. Wrapping around those services, we have family and social service programs as well as programs for the whole community to build the community. And I'm just going to go through the continuum quickly just to give some examples of what those programs are. So our early childhood programs start with Baby College, which is parenting classes on Saturdays for 9 weeks. Parents can be anywhere from expecting to having a 3-year-old. And it's really the entry point for many families. We knock on every door in the zone over and over again, every couple years. Our community workers stand on street corners. Do you have a child? Have you been to Baby College? Do you know anyone else with a child? You look pregnant. Do you want to come to Baby College? Trying to get everybody in. You think I'm kidding, I'm not. Trying to get everybody in and into Baby College and then having their child as part of the pipeline from the beginning. We have a bunch of early childhood programs. We have a 3-year-old journey program, which is also on Saturdays for 3 months. That's for parents of 3-year-olds. It's more sort of in-depth at Baby College. We cover topics that range from discipline to attachment. And then for 4-year-olds, we have an all-day preschool that runs the full year, full day. we have a charter school, which I'll get to in the next slide or two, and we've moved the lottery. Charter schools in New York have to have a lottery, and generally people start doing lotteries for kindergarten. We've actually gotten permission to have our lottery when the kids are 3, so that the kids that get into the school via the lottery can get the limited spots in our preschool programs. Because in the early years, it was very frustrating. We'd have 100 kids come out of our preschool program, and then only 20 of them would get into the school, and so that was very frustrating for us. So we moved the lottery back. We now have the lottery when the kids are 3. Word has gotten out about that, and so we get way more applicants than we have spots. It's, as my boss says, the most depressing day of the year. Our elementary middle school programs, as I said, we run 2 charter schools. We also have staff in all of the public elementary schools. They're called peacemakers. They're funded partially by AmeriCorps, and they're trained in a variety of things, sort of helping the school, helping the teachers, but also in intervening in conflict and trying to take that stuff out of the classroom. We also have a wide variety of middle school, after-school programs reaching kids and trying to come up with whatever different kids' interests are or where their location are. The programs really vary. One of them is really focused on nutrition and exercise, and those are all around the zone as well. In high school, again, our charter school goes up through high school. The charter school is like 7:30 to 4 is the regular school day. It runs through July. And then there's after school for 2 or 3 hours as well, and often they're in on Saturdays. For the kids that are not in our charter school, we also have a variety of after school programs for high school kids. One of them is arts and media based, one of them is technology based, and they're also all around the zone. And the way that we run both our middle school and our high school after school programs is that every kid has a case manager. So that person is not their tutor, but that person knows that kid's history, meets with them on a regular basis to identify what the kid needs. Is it tutoring? Is it some kind of social work intervention? Is there a problem at home? What are the things the kid needs? Identifies a case plan and then follows that through. And then we follow our kids through college. So these are numbers from last year that are up there. We have something over 600 kids that are in college this year who we're supporting, and we support them in any way that we can, through Facebook, through text messages, through phone calls, through campus visits. None of these are kids that went through our charter school. Our charter school hasn't graduated a high school class yet. So these are all kids that have participated in our after-school programs in the last number of years, who we've gotten to apply to college, to get into college, and to stay in college, and we're supporting them in college. And so, we're not done until they're finished college and they, are settled somewhere and productive members of society. In addition to all of those age-appropriate programs, we have these family social service and health programs. One really big one is our asthma initiative, where we've worked with Harlem Hospital and Columbia University, although I'm not entirely sure where that partnership stands right now because they've disaffiliated with each other. But we've been collecting surveys for years, identifying our kids who have asthma or at risk of asthma and getting them regular medical service so that they don't have the frequent emergency room visits that mean missing a lot of school, which can really disrupt kids' education and lead to negative school outcomes. And then our community building programs include tax assistance as well as a lot of residential housing assistance. I won't go into the details of this, but it's in the middle of it right now. As you can imagine, this time of year, all of our sites, people come in, we do their taxes for free. There's no income qualification. You don't have to prove anything. We just do them so we can try to get people to get as much money back as possible. The third principle about HCZ is community building, and some of that was in those community programs, but we have a community advisory board that meets regularly to advise the programs, so the programs are really for the community, what the community wants. We do beautification projects and work with the housing stock and really try to invest the whole community in this process. It's for their kids. I think the vast majority of the staff at HCZ live in the community, are part of the community. There's a ton of my coworkers whose kids are in our schools or in our after-school programs. It's really a central part of the community, and that's also central. And then the fourth principle, and I didn't make this up, is program evaluation. And it's been central to the mission of the organization from the beginning, even before they had hired any researchers. But the idea was you have to look at data to see what's working for the kids, what's not working for the kids, how do we need to change our programs. And we do research, as I said, that's not the kind of research that most of the people in this room do. It's research on a regular basis, looking at, we have goals for every program about kids being ready for school at the end of the year, about their risky behavior, drug and alcohol use. For every age program, we have different goals for where we think those kids should be, and we're measuring them along the way during the year, identifying where there's problems. Do the problems mean we have the wrong goals, or do the problems mean that there's something wrong with the program? If the program's not being effective, can we do research in the field? Has somebody else figured out a way to do this that we can incorporate? And this is just an example of a million charts that we do, but looking at our Harlem GEMS preschool, these are preschool kids at the beginning and the end of the year. The pre-test is the red and the post-test is the green. How they compare on the Bracken test of school readiness to a nationally normed sample, the Bracken's nationally normed sample. And you can see that by the end of the year, our kids are moving much more towards the advanced and very advanced group, and we're always really proud of that, that we get almost 100% of our kids on track, are considered school ready by the end of their GEMS year. And you may be noticing that there's a little group of advanced kids in the pre-test, and that's because most of our preschool program is for 4-year-olds. We do have one center that's a Head Start center, and those kids come in as 3. So this is being tested at the beginning of the 4-year-old year, which is already after a year of 3-year-old Head Start for some small portion of the kids. But really what we do in our department is looking at these kinds of goals along the way, but also translating what the data means to the people that are working with the data. These are people for whom the word regression is a scary word. Possibly spreadsheets are scary. Figuring out for every audience what makes sense for them so they can really understand it and use it to make program better. And the staff, by and large, buys in. They come to us with more questions. They want to know, well, we have this subgroup of kids that's looking worse, or we have this subgroup of kids that's looking better. Can you tell us, why they look like this? And we do a ton of translation. As I said, translating research, translating our own data for our staff. Also, when outside researchers get access to our data, trying to explain different things. We had an outside researcher look at one of our after-school programs once and say, you guys have really low attendance at this program on Fridays. Well, it turns out that program is closed on Fridays. But there are a couple kids that insist on coming anyway, even though it's like staff development time. And so the staff is dutifully marking them as attending, but it looks from the outside like there's some Friday problem, but from the inside, it actually is, we have some hardcore kids that won't go away, which of course is great. So there's always this back and forth about data, and we're able to sort of speak both languages and figure out what the questions are and try to connect things. Some of you may be familiar with Roland Fryer's paper on us, and that was a whole back and forth about us getting him our data and them trying to understand our data. And so I think for us, it's really critical to have this evaluation piece built in. And just to give a sense of what that looks like, there's 5 of us in the evaluation department. There's 3 PhDs. And we do this stuff all day long, and it's central to the mission. So that's just a quick summary of what we think are the really critical principles of the Harlem Children's Zone. And for groups that want to replicate us, none of that, it's not prescriptive. The idea is to look at your neighborhood, the needs in your neighborhood, and then think about these things in the context of your neighborhood. Thank you.
Okay, this is an honor to be here. I'm kind of a pinch hitter. Professor Bidwell fell ill late in the process, and I'm less esteemed and less accomplished than him, but I am old enough to have gray hair, so maybe I'll be a suitable substitute. So I've got 7 slides and 1 question, and this was a little bit tough because the 3 papers are quite different, and only the last one was really close to the type of papers I'm used to reading, but then she didn't actually give the research. So, so this is my attempt to pull lessons together from the 3 papers. Okay? and this is as an economist, you know, there's general pessimism about the prospects for large government-operated monopolies to consistently provide quality education for disadvantaged children. And I think that is not only born of kind of economic theories about rent-seeking and how bureaucracies work, but just an empirical observation that disadvantaged communities receive bad police service, and when they call, the ambulance doesn't come. And for those of you who live in Chicago, the potholes are bigger on the south side and the west side than they are in Lincoln Park. And so it's just kind of an argument that says if cities routinely don't deliver fire protection and police services and fix the streets in disadvantaged communities, is it really a stretch to think they'll run good schools? Because the people that don't have the political power to make sure that the potholes are fixed may not have the political power to make sure the schools run well. And part of this is personal. When I didn't have children of my own 20 years ago, I ran a tutoring program at 64th and Kimbark, and the level of frustration I had in terms of interacting with the Chicago public schools to, you know, get help helping my kids, you know, led me to look outside and see the craters in the street and think, well, no duh. Now, I think in the education research community, for a long time, and I would say until very recently, even though people wouldn't really say this out loud often at conferences, there was a deeper pessimism. And so, you know, it starts with the first Coleman report, and, you know, it starts this narrative of the schools really don't matter. And then Tom Hoffer's here, the second big fuss that, that Coleman and others made was the private schools report. And I think a lot of people that jumped on the methodological details about that report were sure that it had to be wrong. If we could somehow get truth serum in them, part of their conviction was that, you know, the only way these private schools could have done so well if somehow they managed to find the kids that weren't from the dysfunctional homes. That if you really had these kids from the dysfunctional homes, you couldn't help them anyway. And so, but recently, you know, and I've read Rowland's stuff, and I've read the stuff that Angrist and the long list of co-authors are doing in Boston. It's very hard to think that everything we're seeing with HCZ and KIP is somehow a model misspecification. These guys are doing something that is working, and they're doing something that is working incredibly well. And here a minor quibble with Bruce. I think when you look at the voucher literature in the U.S., I think two things are true. One is it's a very small enterprise relative to what goes on in Europe. So we don't know much. The other thing is I think the fair review of what Peterson did is that it was pretty second-rate evaluation research. But the lesson you would take from it is that the private schools that were serving disadvantaged African American communities did a little better with half the money. And so in terms of if you're just focused on outcomes, it's not that encouraging, but if you do outcomes by dollars spent, you have a different view on it. And the more important things, if you think there's more things that go on at school than just test scores, the parents felt infinitely better even in these schools in the Peterson studies, they all felt infinitely better about how their children were doing in terms of safety and developing non-cognitive and social skills. So there's some encouragement there, but KIPP and Harlem Children's Zone, I think, have taken us to a new level of hope in terms of what's possible. But, here's where the tension is. KIPP and Harlem Children's Zone are doing things very differently than a traditional public school. Okay? And we know, as you said correctly, that a lot of the charters have been experiments that failed. And so we have to think about how we build a public system in terms of public funding, because if any rationale for publicly funding education is going to be a rationale that says I have some type of interest in the education of your children, and so I have some type of interest in knowing how my dollars are being spent to educate your child. So we're never going to get around this need as long as we have public funding, regardless of who does the provision, for having some kind of accountability system for the providers and some rule that says you're no longer worthy to receive public funding to educate children if you're. And what we haven't figured out is how to do that type of evaluation so that we provide accountability performance, but we also provide flexibility so that people can innovate and so that those innovations can be copied. I have an iPhone just for the email. My kids think I'm the dumbest person in the world that I have no apps on my iPhone. But the thing about it is, it took 3 years for every company under the sun to come up with a copy of the iPhone. And a lot of the copies are better than the original. And so, we have to ask ourselves what's institutionally holding back KIPP kind of spreading all over the country, or HCZ spreading all over the country. Because I think this whole best practice thing within the traditional public school model is not necessarily the right way to think about it. I don't think the key thing is trying to figure out one best practice. I think the key thing is trying to figure out an overall system where when people find some practice that works, they have the freedom to implement it. Okay? And so in Europe, there's a lot of voucher systems. I mean, people don't realize this because Europeans are too liberal politically to call them voucher systems. But in places like the Netherlands or Denmark or Sweden, it's national vouchers. Every school, whether it's a Catholic school or a Protestant school or a school run by the United Way or a school run by the government, is funded by some formula that's a function of attendance. Okay? And so schools can locate where they want to, they can organize how they want to, but they all hire teachers. This is a table from a paper I wrote. Look at the middle column, regulation of teacher salaries. In all these countries, and England has a little bit of this too, in all these countries, it doesn't matter what type of school you work in, you're paid based on the same union contract organized at the national level. And so, for an economist, this is a little bit confusing because in the Netherlands, the schools are pretty good, okay? And so it appears that somehow the parents having the ability to walk and take a bunch of funds away from the school and force the school to fire teachers, it appears that that lever is enough, even with a teachers' union and national bargaining, to kind of constrain the craziness of the work rules. I'm not sure. We need to study this more. But, it's the one thing that, kept coming to me over and over again as I thought about this is that you could never do what KIPP does. And the research on this point said you could never do what KIPP does in a traditional public schools because the unions would never allow it. Okay? And you couldn't do what Harlem Children's Zone is doing. And, everybody's going to be here. I wrote down her name. everybody's going to, I saw this in the paper, everybody's going to be hearing in the next few months about Megan Sampson, who was the teacher of the year for 2010 in Wisconsin and lost her job in Milwaukee last year because when there was a showdown between the union and the Milwaukee Public Schools, the union picked layoffs rather than cutting the health care benefits, and she didn't have enough seniority to keep her job. And so it is, and you know, there's no easy answers. If you bust the unions and get rid of the unions, you won't have anybody who's the teacher of the year fired anymore because they didn't have enough seniority, but you could have her fired because the principal wanted to hire his brother and we're not enforcing the civil service. So we have to kind of start over and think about what types of accountability systems hold whole organizations accountable for using public funds appropriately or using the tax deduction from their nonprofit appropriately. And then how do we have the political will so that that actually works and we don't end up with a situation where 20 years from now, even if we had charter schools everywhere, somehow the equivalent of the Charter School Chamber of Commerce captured government in the same way that the teachers' unions have captured the work rules, and then accountability wasn't accountability anymore. I think the whole thing of setting up systems to encourage innovation and competition between the innovators while holding people accountable is key. And the last thing, because I think the thing about the rich families using the nonprofits is very interesting because I see it all the time in the suburbs where I live, and I live in a baseball crazy suburb that's a fairly wealthy suburb, and you live there 5 minutes and you understand why in the 1970s 1/3 of Major League Baseball players were African American and now 8% are. Because travel baseball is for rich white kids. And they get twice the training and twice the access to instruction from a very early age. And maybe we don't care when it's baseball. But that's an illustration. If you put in quality education in that story, that's a story about how these different ways to get services provided can lead to persistent inequality across groups if poor people are relying on dysfunctional public service providers.